Working as an editor in the field of science and engineering in South Korea has taught me a lot. Not about science and engineering, but about the passive voice, a sentence structure that is overused and misunderstood by scientists, Koreans, and especially by Korean scientists. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not one of these editors who thinks that every instance of the passive voice is a mistake. The passive voice is a tool. There's a right way and many wrong ways of using it, which we'll explore in today's video. But I'm here to tell you that most of the time, and I mean like 80 to 90% of the time I come across the passive voice, it is used improperly, resulting in awkward, unclear sentences, which is to say, bad writing. What is up? It's WJROK, and if you're new here, my name is Will, and I'm a professor of English at Ulsan National Institute of Science and Technology in South Korea, and today we are going to be talking about the passive voice, what it is, why it's a problem, and when it's a good idea to use it. Now, this is one of the most common errors that I come across when I'm proofreading scientific manuscripts by Koreans and native English speakers alike. So if that sounds like something that would help you on your way to becoming a better writer, then you can help this video out by giving it a like. Thanks! Now, because I deal with the passive voice day in, day out, this video is probably going to start off with me completely hating the passive voice before developing into like a more balanced appreciation for its benefits and drawbacks, so bear with me. But at the beginning, I just need to get this out and say that you need to stop using the passive voice because it is draining the life out of your writing. There, I said it. Feels good. And if that sounds too strong, then you should just hear what some of the editors at top scientific journals and style guides have to say about the passive voice. The Astronomical Society of the Pacific, for example, advises writers to avoid the passive voice as you would the Ebola virus, using it for only around 10% of your sentences. If the passive voice is like the Ebola virus, then personally, I would probably try to shoot for a little bit lower than 10%, but okay, we get the point. Top journals and style guides like Nature, Science, and the American Psychological Association all have formal policies against the passive voice. So although this video is going to try to give you a fairly balanced look at the pros and cons of the passive voice, this makes me nervous. I don't want you to use the information in this video as license to go wild with the passive voice and start using it all over the place. My best advice right up front is to always maintain a prejudice against the passive voice and use it only when you have very good reason to do. But before we look at the three major problems caused by the passive voice, you're probably wondering, what is voice and what's it got to do with writing? Voice is what tells us who performed the action of a verb. Verbs aren't just happening out there in the world on their own. There are actors performing those verbs, and the easiest way to find the actor of a verb is to look at the sentence and ask yourself, who does what? For example, when we look at the sentence, the curious writer smashed the like button, and we ask ourselves, who does what? We find that it was the curious writer who did the smashing. And that's the way it usually is. The noun in the subject position, which is at the start of the sentence to the left of the verb, is usually the one who performs the action. That's what we call the active voice, when the noun in the subject position performs the action of the verb. The basic structure for the active voice is A does B. The passive voice actually flips this structure on its head. So when we look at the passive sentence, the like button was smashed by the curious writer, we find that the noun in the subject position, the like button, doesn't perform the action of the verb smash, it receives the smashing. The actor is way over on the other side of the verb in the object position. So in the passive voice, the subject doesn't perform the action of the verb, it receives the action of the verb. The basic structure for the passive voice is B is done by A. And we'll talk about why by A is in parentheses in just a little bit. To form a passive sentence, we need to perform some surgery on an active one, cutting it up, rearranging its parts, and adding some new words to hold everything together. So let's start off with a nice, healthy sentence in the active voice. Hemingway wrote the novels. First, we move the core object, the novels, to the subject position in front of the verb, and move the core subject, Hemingway, to the object position at the back of the sentence. Second, put the core subject, the doer of the verb, Hemingway, into a prepositional phrase headed by the preposition by. The last step is to change the core verb into its past participle form, written, and introduce the helping verb, to be, into the auxiliary position next to the verb. Tense is expressed in the auxiliary, so to be becomes were. And voila, we have the passive voice. Now, when you look at these sentences, there's an important feature of the passive voice that I really want you to see. Notice how the passive voice moves the subject, the doer of the verb, from the start of the sentence to the end of the sentence. This is an important feature of the passive voice, and it's the source of both its advantages and disadvantages when it comes to your own writing style. The other key feature of the passive voice that I want to draw your attention to is the way in which it makes this doer of the verb optional. By contrast with the active voice, with its A does B structure, you're really forced to say who or what performed the action of the verb. That is, you could not just say builds the house, wrote the novels, will ride the bike. You're forced to say who or what will build the house, write the novels, ride the bike. So the active voice, with its A does B structure, forces you to say who or what performed the action of the verb. The passive voice is a lot more flexible in this regard. It makes it possible to say that the action of a verb happened without forcing you to say who or what performed the action of that verb. Now, you can still identify the actor if you want to through this by phrase, but it's important to note that this by phrase is completely optional. That is, it's entirely grammatical to say the house is built. The novels were written. The bike will be ridden. And these two features are exactly why scientists, Koreans, and especially Korean scientists love the passive voice. Because the passive voice makes it possible to talk about the action of a verb without having to identify who or what performed that action, scientists think that the passive voice makes them sound more objective, more scientific. And since the passive voice rearranges the sentence structure so that the verb comes at the end of the sentence, Koreans, or anyone whose mother tongue is a subject-object-verb language, such as, feel more comfortable writing in the passive voice because it more closely resembles the grammar of their first language. But what these writers fail to understand is that these two features, that is, moving the doer of the verb to the end of the sentence and making the doer optional, actually causes three major problems in English writing. First, the active voice adds extra, unnecessary words to a sentence. A passive sentence means exactly the same thing as an active one, but it takes up more space to say it, adding the verb to be and the preposition by. It also uses the less common past participle instead of the more familiar form of the verb. Now, when it comes to writing style, it's generally better to write as clearly and straightforwardly as possible. Don't use 10 words when 7 will do. Second, the passive voice doesn't clearly say who does what. The core of a passive sentence simply says that a verb happened. This defies reality. Verbs aren't just out there in the world happening on their own, there are actors performing those verbs. But the core of the passive sentence doesn't tell us who performed the action of the verb. If you want to identify the actor, you need to tack on this prepositional by phrase, which functions as an adverb of agency. So the active voice gives us a more clear sense of who did what. Finally, and this is a big one, is that the passive voice, B is done by A, actually works against English sentence structure. Now, you probably already know that the fundamental structure of the English language is subject, verb, object, SVO. So for example, in the sentence, the man walked the dog, the subject, the man, comes before the verb, and the object, the dog, comes after the verb. A does B. So when you're writing in English, you need to keep this sentence structure in mind and remember that this is what your reader is expecting. So when you give the reader a sentence like the dog was walked by the man, OVS, B is done by A, you actually make it harder for the reader to interpret the information. The reader is expecting SVO, A does B, but the passive voice gives her OVS, B is done by A. Now, this isn't technically wrong, both sentences mean exactly the same thing, but since the passive voice is making it harder for the reader to process the information on the page, you better have a good reason to use it. And there are, in fact, a few good reasons to use it, 4 to be exact, but I'm a little reluctant to present them to you because I don't want the takeaway of this video to be like, hey, here are 4 great ways to use the passive voice. The problems that we just went over are significant, and you need to keep them in mind and always maintain a prejudice against the passive voice. It's more important to the style of your writing to stop using the passive voice improperly than it is for you to start using it properly. Nevertheless, if you feel like you must use the passive voice, then make sure that it is in one of the following 4 situations. Since the passive voice makes the doer of the verb optional, it's perfect for whenever the actor is unknown, unimportant, or when you simply don't want to mention who performed the action of the verb. So in the sentence, the young couple were married on a warm summer's day, the action of the verb marry was performed by some authority, like a judge or a priest. However, the focus of this sentence is not on the judge or the priest, it's on the young couple and the warm summer's day. So the passive voice is great because the actor of the verb is unimportant. In the sentence, my wallet was stolen, we don't know who stole the wallet, so the passive voice is perfect. If we wrote that in the active voice, A does B, we would have to introduce a dummy subject like somebody stole my wallet. So the passive voice is great for whenever you actually don't know who performed the action of the verb. And of course, politicians love the passive voice because it lets them talk about mistakes without actually saying who made those mistakes.
There may be a situation here in which a serious mistake was made.
Clearly, mistakes were made.
There were mistakes made.
Second, at award shows, why do you think we always say something like,
and the Oscar goes to Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman.
and not Al Pacino gets the award for Best Actor? As you might have guessed, there is a certain emphasis that comes at the end of a sentence that you don't find in the middle or the beginning. And for that reason, it's generally a good idea to organize the information in your sentences from old to new. Old information at the beginning, new information at the end. And the passive voice helps us organize that information sometimes. So for an example of the old to new principle, let's take a look at this famous science paper about the discovery of DNA. We wish to suggest a structure for the salt of deoxyribose nucleic acid, DNA. This structure has novel features which are of considerable biological interest. A structure for nucleic acid has already been proposed by Pauling and Corey. Now, each of these 3 sentences are organized from old to new. Old information at the start of the sentence, new information at the end. Sentence 1 is in the active voice. Sentence 2 is also in the active. But then sentence 3 switches to the passive voice. Why the sudden switch to the passive voice? If they had written sentence 3 in the active voice, it would read, Pauling and Corey have already proposed a structure for nucleic acid. But that's no good. The structure for nucleic acid is old news. The new information is Pauling and Corey. So in order to move the new information to the end of the sentence, the authors wrote this sentence in the passive voice. If you look at the sentences independently, then the active voice is clearly better. It's more clear, more concise, and more straightforward than the passive. But within the context of this paragraph, the passive voice allows the writers to maintain the old to new principle, which helps the reader integrate the new information and gives a nice flow to the overall passage. The passive voice is great if what we want to emphasize is the doer of the verb. And that often happens whenever we are organizing the information in a sentence from old to new. Third, the passive voice is great whenever we're dealing with heavy information. Now, by heavy information, I mean a noun phrase that's attached to a relative clause, such as, the artist who woke before dawn to paint the sunrise. Now, this is not a sentence, it's a noun phrase. The head of the noun phrase is the artist, and it's being modified by the relative clause, who woke before dawn to paint the sunrise. If you put a heavy noun phrase like that into the subject position of a sentence, such as, the artist who woke before dawn to paint the sunrise did not attend the dinner party, you make the reader do a lot of work to find the core verb of the sentence. In such cases, you can really help the reader out by moving this heavy noun phrase out of the way of the verb. Put it into the object position at the end of the sentence by switching the sentence to the passive voice. The dinner party was not attended by the artist who woke before dawn to paint the sunrise. The last use case for the passive voice is that sometimes the passive voice just sounds better. An active sentence like, a helicopter crash killed the basketball player is awkward because helicopter crashes aren't really out there killing basketball players. They happen to basketball players. So even though the grammar of that sentence is all right, it's not exactly idiomatic. It's better to say that the basketball player was killed by a helicopter crash or in a helicopter crash. So there you have 4 use cases for when it is a good idea to use the passive voice. But this is not licensed to go crazy with the passive voice. Again, the majority of the time I come across the passive voice, it is used improperly, which causes clumsy, awkward, and unclear sentences. In general, the passive voice is overused and abused by careless writers. Please don't be one of them. Instead, understand the key features of the passive voice, how it moves the subject to the end of the sentence and makes that subject optional, can improve your writing. And if you want to learn more about how the passive voice can be used to improve your own writing, then I'll leave a link to a more in-depth blog post right below the like button, which can be smashed by you if you found this video helpful. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.